Friends, Not Masters. A Political Autobiography. Mohammad Ayub Khan, President of Pakistan. Published in 1967. This is a Plisken audiobook presentation dedicated to those who have worked for the building of Pakistan as a progressive and modern state, and to those who have defended it with such distinction. Chapter 4. Commander-in-Chief. There was considerable speculation about the prospects of a Pakistani being appointed Commander-in-Chief at the end of General Gracie's term. Gracie would have liked to continue, but the feeling was growing that the army should be commanded by a Pakistani. At the back of this might have been Gracie's refusal to issue instructions to Pakistan troops to move into Kashmir, as desired by the Quaid-e-Azam in October 1947, without the approval of Lord Mountbatten, who was the supreme commander. It is claimed that the Quaid-e-Azam had agreed to revise his orders at the intervention of Auchinleck, but in the process Gracie had not enhanced his reputation with the people. I remember that long before the appointment of the new Commander-in-Chief, Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan came to Rawalpindi. There was a divisional commanders' conference, and I had come from East Pakistan to attend. The Prime Minister sent for senior Pakistani officers and addressed them at the Circuit House. Towards the end of his address, he said that it had been decided to appoint a Pakistani as the next Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Army. He mentioned that the government had not yet selected the person, but that it was possible that the appointment would not go to the most senior officer. He wanted to know the likely repercussions among senior officers, in case a person lower in the order of seniority was chosen. He asked several officers, and finally turned to me. I was sitting at the end. He said, "General Ayub Khan, would you like to say something?" I said, "Sir, may I say with great respect that this question should never have been asked. Our drill is simple and clear. As army officers we serve to the best of our ability and leave the judgment to our superiors. Whatever decision they take, whether we like it or not, we must accept it. And if somebody is not prepared to accept that decision, he should get the hell out of the army." I think General Raza and a few others were among the senior-most officers, and they were frequently spoken of. There was also a great deal of talk about General Iftikhar, a good officer. There was an impression that the British were backing him. Unfortunately, he and General Sher Khan were killed in an air crash at Jungshahi. General Iftikhar was a difficult man to get on with, and he was short-tempered. I do not know how he would have done as Commander-in-Chief, but I am certain that he would have met with considerable difficulty. By the time I came to Rawalpindi as Adjutant General, the talk about the identity of the next Commander-in-Chief had become very lively. Once or twice my wife also asked me who was likely to be appointed Commander-in-Chief. I remember telling her, "Quite honestly, I do not know, but I do know that whoever is appointed, I shall have to do a great deal of work for him." People then started making direct inquiries of me. I thought the best way to avoid all the gossip was to take some leave. So I took my wife and children and retired to the cool heights of Changlagali for 2 months. Finally, one September night in 1950, I was rung up by an officer of the Ministry of Defence and informed that I had been selected as the next Commander-in-Chief. I was deeply conscious of the great responsibilities lying ahead of me. I prayed to God that He grant me the courage and ability to prove myself equal to the task. It was an event of some significance for the country. After nearly 200 years, a Muslim army in the subcontinent would have a Muslim Commander-in-Chief. I knew that whatever traditions and standards were established would continue to guide the army for a long time. I was determined that I should establish the highest standards in professional work and in all my dealings with people. I was going to be entrusted with the job of organizing a young army. It was a great challenge and a great opportunity. My first concern would be to instill a sense of self-respect among members of the armed forces. They must learn to stand on their own feet and be judged on merit. I was soon to learn that this was going to prove far more difficult than I had visualized. General Gracie took the announcement in very good part. I was appointed Deputy Commander-in-Chief so that I should be able to make myself familiar with the work. I went to Germany and England on a short visit to study military establishments. I took over as Commander-in-Chief on January 17, 1951. General Gracie did not say very much to me when he was leaving. Not much can be done in handing over and taking over a job like this, and the new man must start all on his own. But he did mention to me somewhat vaguely that there was a Young Turk party in the army. I wanted to know what he meant by that. He was not very explicit, but did say that there were some peculiar people, like Akbar Khan. 2 or 3 months later, the Akbar conspiracy, which came to be known as the Rawalpindi conspiracy, was discovered. I learnt of the conspiracy from Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan. He was on an electioneering tour at the time, and sent for Iskander Mirza and me to meet him at Sargodha railway station. He had called me from Lahore and Iskander Mirza from Karachi. I arrived about an hour and a half earlier than Iskander Mirza. I noticed that the Prime Minister was a little restless. This was unusual because he normally maintained an impeccable calm and never showed any signs of ill temper. He inquired about Iskander Mirza and said, "What has happened to this damned fellow? Why has he not turned up so far?" It was lunchtime when Iskander Mirza arrived. The Prime Minister asked us to join him at lunch, and throughout he continued to talk to us in a normal, almost casual way. When lunch was over, he leaned back and said, "Gentlemen, I have bad news for you. It has come to my knowledge that a military coup to overthrow the government has been planned by certain army officers, and it is going to be put into effect very soon." I immediately asked for details. He gave me the full text of the report, which he had received from I. Chandragar, who was then governor of the Northwest Frontier Province. I suggested we should check the facts before taking any action. Iskander and I went to Peshawar to see the governor and the police officer who had passed on the report to him, and also the informer. I spoke to the governor and later met Kiani, the police officer. Kiani did not want to expose his informer, but we finally got hold of him. While I questioned Kiani, Iskander Mirza interrogated the informer. It was soon clear that an uprising had been planned. One of the conspirators was Brigadier Siddiq Khan, who had served in my unit at one time and was then commanding a brigade at Bannu. He was a rather unstable type, emotional and impulsive. I sent an aircraft for him and told him, "Siddiq, you tell me the truth, or I shall string you upside down." Siddiq denied all knowledge, and claimed that the report was completely false. We allowed him to go back to Bannu. On arrival there he rang up Colonel Ababat Thal, who, as it transpired later, was another of the conspirators. Siddiq told him that the cat was out of the bag. This confirmed my fear that a serious plot to overthrow the government had been hatched. By then we had enough material to go back and report to the Prime Minister, and he decided that we should take immediate action. Inspector General of Police Qurban Ali Khan was put in the picture, and all the officers and civilians involved in the conspiracy were arrested in their houses the same night. My first idea was to hold a court-martial to try the case, but the difficulty was that certain civilians were also involved. The Prime Minister decided that a special civil tribunal be set up, and the trial held in camera to prevent exposure of state secrets. The trial was held in Hyderabad jail, and Suhrawardy was engaged by the accused as defense counsel. Suhrawardy was a complex character, a man who loved the gay life of nightclubs and had tremendous energy and drive. He took great delight in attacking the army officers who appeared as witnesses, and I felt he far overstepped the mark in his cross-examination. The court, however, remained passive. There was nothing I could do about it at the time. The conspirators were convicted and sentenced. Some years later, Suhrawardy and his supporters prevailed on the government to release them. That was the prerogative of the government, and I could not object. But what I could not forgive was Suhrawardy's unnecessarily harsh and undignified cross-examination of the army officers. Afterwards, when we were both cabinet ministers, in a cabinet meeting when the subject of the conspiracy was raised, and Suhrawardy made some comment, I rounded on him, and said that he had done great harm to the army at the trial, and that he was no friend of Pakistan. He did not reply. Later, when he was to be appointed Prime Minister, I happened to be in Karachi, and Iskander Mirza called me and said, "We are going to appoint Mr. Suhrawardy as the Prime Minister. In that capacity he will also be your Defence Minister, and you know that he would like to settle his account with you. He suggested that we meet." Suhrawardy came to President's house. I told him that I knew his feelings towards me and that no doubt he knew my feelings towards him. But as Commander-in-Chief, I would obey and carry out whatever legitimate and lawful orders were given to me. At the same time I would expect that there would be no interference in the internal affairs of the army. Sohrawardi found that an acceptable arrangement, and we shook hands on it. I must say that he never interfered with the affairs of the army, and whenever I went to him, I always found him ready to listen, and to give decisions. The Rawalpindi conspiracy had deep roots. It grew in the soil of discontent and distrust, and it was able to develop for several reasons. There was considerable unrest among the officers caused by a spate of swift promotions from junior to senior ranks. This raised expectations to unwarranted heights. Every officer felt that unless he was made commander-in-chief, no one would believe that he had done well in life. It was a curious phenomenon. Perfectly sensible people, brigadiers and generals, would go about bemoaning their lot. Each one of them was a Bonaparte, albeit an unhappy one. I used to tell myself that, but for independence, I would have been lucky to have become a brigadier. Even after independence, I would have considered myself eminently successful if I had retired as a major general. The most usual military expectation is the command of a unit, the rank of lieutenant colonel, and then retirement from service. It was this sudden devaluation of the higher posts which produced fantastic ideas and ambitions in people. Then there was the fighting in Kashmir. It started as an irregular campaign. Soldiers and officers were out on their own with little direction from headquarters, and with considerable responsibility placed in the hands of junior officers. But I think the main reason for this discontent was that we had a government which failed to discharge its functions properly. When Akbar Khan's papers were seized, we found among them a thesis in which he had accused the Prime Minister, and everybody else in the government, of inefficiency, and inability to give decisions. Akbar Khan's aim was to establish a tidier form of government. He was a brave officer, enjoying considerable prestige in the service, but ambitious and a very persuasive talker. He knew how to influence people, and he had cast his net widely and unobtrusively. Although I never thought for a moment that he could be planning to overthrow the government, I had always been a little suspicious of him. I knew of his ambition, of his family background, and also of his political leanings. When, as commander-in-chief, I had to promote certain officers to the rank of Major General, including Akbar Khan, I pondered for some time what I should do with him. I decided to post him to General Headquarters as Chief of General Staff. I did this to ensure that he remained under my eye, and also not in direct command of troops. I noticed that as Chief of General Staff, he was inclined to neglect his duties and spent a lot of time in Azad Kashmir, in meeting the students and others. I gave him 1 or 2 tasks which he did not complete in time. I had told him, for example, that he should arrange the procurement of hard rations, such as concentrates which were necessary for our men employed in enemy territory. He kept avoiding me. I said to myself, this man is either inefficient or has not got his heart in the job, or his mind is working on something else. It was a kind of premonition. Footnote: Akbar Khan was tried by a special tribunal and convicted. After serving part of his sentence he was released, and has become a private citizen. The whole affair came as a great shock to me, and to all right-thinking people in the army. The prestige of the army had received a grievous blow. People could legitimately ask what kind of a shield had they got. The army had inherited a great tradition of loyalty, sense of duty, patriotism, and complete subordination to civil authority. No one could imagine that when the country was in a difficult situation, this great instrument of stability would prove so vulnerable. I shudder to think what would have happened to the army and the country if the conspiracy had succeeded. There were 2 possible ways of its succeeding: 1, swift and complete success, without any clash within the armed forces, because the conspirators would have placed people like myself and other loyal senior army officers under arrest, before we could take any counteraction. The army might or might not have accepted this change. In any case, there would have been a period of complete confusion. And then if Akbar Khan and his ilk had been clever enough, they might have been able to hold their positions and control the situation. On the other hand, the chances were that some of us might have got an inkling, and moved troops to anticipate and counter the action of the conspirators. The result would have been a clash between units of the Pakistan army. If that had happened, the Indian army would have marched in. That was what I was really afraid of. I quickly recovered from the shock and set out to restore the dignity, efficiency and self-confidence of the army. Once that was achieved, I felt that it would regain its prestige in the eyes of the people of Pakistan. We examined the antecedents of officers and got rid of the doubtful ones. We tightened up on discipline, embarked on extensive training exercises, and I kept moving around and visiting various units. I knew that the cancer had been removed, but that there was still a tremendous amount of lost ground to be regained. Paradoxical as it might seem, I was in a sense grateful that I had so much to do, and that I could lose myself in my work, for the malaise in the political and administrative life of Pakistan was becoming painful. Karachi was a hotbed of intrigues. It was providential that army headquarters were in Rawalpindi. I would come back from my occasional visits to Karachi depressed and distressed, wondering what was happening to the country. Why were people not attending to their work with some honesty of purpose, and why could they not evolve some team spirit? Why all these factions, dissensions and disputes? And why all this malice and distrust? They were all busy destroying one another. It used to take me 3 or 4 days to recover from a Karachi visit. I would then say to myself, Karachi is over there and we are here, let us run the army. I found my escape in working harder, and working the soldiers harder. As Commander-in-Chief I had to take certain problems to Karachi. I would ask Iskander Mirza, who was Defense Secretary, whether he would like to take them up with the Prime Minister. He always wanted me to go and see the Prime Minister myself. It developed into a tedious routine. First, to get the Prime Minister's decisions, then to explain them to the Defense Secretary for follow-up action. Sometimes Iskander Mirza had to check on certain decisions with the Prime Minister. At one of my meetings with the Prime Minister, I suggested that it would be convenient if the Defense Secretary could also be present. Liaquat Ali Khan said, "You might bring him along, but you should know that I do not like him." After that Iskander Mirza and I used to go to the Prime Minister together, and their relationship improved. In 1951, when the Indians built up heavy military concentrations against us all along the border, Liaquat Ali Khan seemed tempted by the prospect of war. He said, "I'm tired of these alarums and excursions, let us fight it out." I submitted to him that before making up his mind, he should take into account the views of those whose profession it was to fight. We had only 13 tanks with about 40 to 50 hours engine life in them to face the Indian Army at the time. And not only our politicians but our troops were itching to settle accounts with India. It was my job to hold them back, which thank heavens I did. The Prime Minister was a sound man basically, always prepared to consider the pros and cons of a situation dispassionately, and he never acted in a hurry. I grew to admire Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan enormously. He had a stout heart and was a man of great courage. Nothing ever perturbed him. He had served as a loyal lieutenant of the Quaid-e-Azam, always content to work in the background. He was a lonely man. In a position like that you do become lonely, and sometimes I got the feeling that he was beginning to rely more and more on me. I would give him unbiased and honest opinion on problems when he consulted me. I noticed that he was very much under the influence of Chowdhury Muhammad Ali. Towards the end, Liaquat was being challenged from several quarters. Politics became regionalized, with the result that the Prime Minister was forced to depend more and more on the refugee group. The tension in the Punjab was growing because of the squabbles between the Nawab of Mamdot and Mian Mumtaz Daltana. The affairs of the Muslim League, the governing party, were in a mess. The Muslim League High Command and the Working Committee were controlled by a small coterie of men, and the party had no organizational structure. Conflicts between the provinces were developing, and demands from East Pakistan were becoming more insistent. It looked as if Liaquat Ali Khan might prove too slow to regain the initiative. His eyesight was deteriorating. I noticed that he would hold papers at a particular angle to read them. The people around him were equally slow and indecisive. There was nobody who could make up his mind about anything. It seems to me, however, that this disintegration had started earlier, even in the Quaid-e-Azam's time, with people like Chowdhury Khalikuddin challenging his authority. A few months after the trial of the Rawalpindi conspirators, the Prime Minister was assassinated while delivering a public speech. This happened in Rawalpindi on October 16, 1951. The motive of the crime was never established. I was in a London clinic at that time undergoing treatment for amoebic dysentery. For 5 or 6 years I had been running a low temperature. I had an appendicitis operation in 1951, and thereafter something went wrong with my system. I remember that Habib Ibrahim Rahimtullah, our High Commissioner in London, rang me up in the hospital and gave me the tragic news. It came as a great personal blow, for I had a high regard and liking for Liaquat Ali Khan, and I knew too that his death was a terrible loss to the country. Before long it became apparent that none of the Prime Minister's associates was capable of filling the gap created by his death. Conditions throughout the country deteriorated rapidly, and we witnessed the start of a woeful chapter in our country's history, and one which was to drag on its unhappy course for several years. When I returned to Pakistan, I met several members of the new cabinet in Karachi: Prime Minister Khawaja Nazimuddin, Chaudhry Muhammad Ali, Mushtaq Ahmad Gumani and others. Not one of them mentioned Liaquat Ali Khan's name, nor did I hear a word of sympathy or regret from any one of them. Governor-General Ghulam Mohammad seemed equally unaware of the fact that the country had lost an eminent and capable Prime Minister through the fell act of an assassin. I wondered at how callous, cold-blooded and selfish people could be. It seemed that everyone or them had got himself promoted in one way or another. The termination of the Prime Minister's life had come as the beginning of a new career for them. It was disgusting and revolting. It may be a harsh thing to say, but I got the distinct impression that they were all feeling relieved that the only person who might have kept them under control had disappeared from the scene. The political arena was now available to them for a free-for-all. The assassination of the Prime Minister caused universal anguish. There were all kinds of wild rumours, and some cabinet ministers and highly placed individuals were accused of having plotted the murder. I did not for a moment believe that any one of them was directly or indirectly involved in the assassination. I know that Begum Liaquat Ali Khan still thinks the government did not try hard enough to investigate the assassination and bring the culprits to book. I have seen the report of the expert who was called from Scotland Yard. He could find no evidence to show that the assassination was anything but the act of an individual. Had there been any complicity or involvement of any kind, I have no doubt that it would have been discovered. These things do not remain hidden. It was my belief at that time that Liaquat Ali Khan could have blossomed into an active and positive leader of the nation. I hoped he would put his foot down and crush all the intrigues. Unfortunately, he did not live long enough to give a clear lead and direction to the country. Both these unfortunate events, the Rawalpindi conspiracy and the assassination of the Prime Minister, occurred during the first few months of my assumption of office as Commander-in-Chief. I initiated certain schemes for the reorganization of the army immediately after the conspiracy was discovered. The political turmoil which appeared in the wake of the Prime Minister's death convinced me that we must not lose any time in building up the army which alone could hold the country together and defend it against any possible attack. India appeared to be watching these developments with satisfaction, and I later learnt from Sheikh Abdullah that Pandit Nehru told him at the time that Pakistan would disintegrate in a couple of years. He wanted to come to some arrangement with Sheikh Abdullah on the assumption that Pakistan would soon cease to be a political entity. Whatever institutions we had inherited at the time of independence, or had set up since then, were crumbling one by one. People had fast lost their initial enthusiasm, and found themselves surrounded by problems, with no one to attend to them. Everyone now joined in the political vaudeville. There was no organ of administration which was not pressed into service to promote individual political interests. All this hardened my determination to keep the army completely aloof from politics. Even though senior army officers were conscious of what was going on in the political sphere, I never permitted them to discuss political affairs. One of the first things I did as Commander-in-Chief was to set up a planning board, of which General Yahya, the Deputy Chief of General Staff, became the first chairman. I would assign specific tasks to the board for study. None of us spared himself, and before one task was completed, another would be there to engage our attention. Our basic weapon was man. This was what I wanted my colleagues to realize. We must first solve all his problems and remove his difficulties, whether personal or professional, before this weapon could become fully effective. His conditions of service should be secure, and he must have adequate incentives for work. The education of his children, his medical care, his food, his dress, and his accommodation should be our concern. The less he had to worry, the more active interest would he have in his work. While it took me some time to resolve the financial problems which I have already mentioned, we went ahead to set up agricultural and dairy farms, and took steps to improve the breed of livestock. A number of horse breeding centers were opened, and we ensured the provision of a balanced and nutritious diet for everyone in the army. New medical centers and hospitals were set up, and trained and efficient doctors and nurses provided. The ex-soldier and his dependents were also taken care of, through the investment of the pre-partition post-war reconstruction fund. By 1964, about 2.6 million rupees per annum were being spent for the education and welfare of ex-soldiers and their dependents. To attract the right type of young men, a number of cadet colleges and academies were established. To support these institutions, a chain of public schools was started. All these reforms had an immediate impact on recruitment and morale. My principal concern, however, was to train the army on appropriate lines. There was too much routine and drudgery and too little purpose in what we were asking the men to do. Most of the time they hardly knew what it meant, they just obeyed and followed. Was this the way to get the best out of them? Our organization and establishments were based on Second World War concepts which, apart from being cumbersome, had become completely obsolete. The army was organized not so much for the defense of the homeland, as for an expeditionary force. This was understandable, as the primary role of the old Indian Army was to support the British forces in creating and policing British overseas interests. We inherited 6 infantry divisions, 1 armoured brigade and a few training and static installations at the time of independence. This looked quite impressive on paper. What we got, in fact, were truncated formations and units critically deficient in essential equipment. India's refusal to give us our share of armaments, equipment and stores further added to our problems. After the war, armies throughout the world carried out extensive research and modified their organizations in the light of new weapons and new requirements. We were unable to do so immediately after independence because of our other pressing problems. Apart from following outmoded concepts, we suffered from serious shortcomings in logistic and training facilities. The country could not afford the extra expenditure required for making up deficiencies in essential units and equipment, and for balancing and re-equipping the army. I started with a review of the organization and structure of field formations and units in order to achieve balance, with increased mobility and firepower. Manpower was reduced, wherever possible. Simultaneously, the operative procedures of our schools, training centers, depots and other logistic installations were raised. It was here that the planning board proved particularly useful. The board would analyze different problems and come to me directly with recommendations, thus eliminating the tedious routine of ministerial processes. The first essential in reorganizing the army was to shift the emphasis from learning the technique of war to understanding the art of war. The important thing was to develop capability to apply the principles of war to areas of higher tactics and strategy. In the system that we inherited, there was little room for original thinking. Loyalty had become synonymous with blind obedience, and there was little attempt at reflection or criticism. The whole system of training and promotion was directed to the production of stereotyped men, and nothing new or unusual could emerge at any level. Worse still, we were completely dependent on foreign countries for our tactical doctrines and methods. It was a sad commentary on our methods of training that our men, who are natural hunters and stalkers, should become tactically clumsy after spending 6 months in the army. They lost all their resourcefulness, flexibility and skill, and became rigid, stereotyped and inhibited. We were killing in them all that was natural. Clearly there was need for fundamental rethinking and drastic changes. Our officers had spirit and intelligence, but they were lacking in sympathy, with the result that their relationship with their men was governed by the rigid principle of command and obedience. I also thought that we might adopt a system of attaching outstanding officers to other professions so that they might be able to add a new dimension to their experience and acquire breadth of vision. I knew that whatever plans for reorganization we might evolve, they had to suit the likely operational role of the army and the geographic conditions and national characteristics and temperament of our people, apart from being sound in theory. Moreover, all new concepts and establishments should be within our means, and the objective should be to achieve balance, increased firepower, and battle efficiency in as economical a manner as possible. The operational and tactical background for reorganization was closely examined, and comprehensive studies prepared to evolve new elements in strategy and organization. Each one of these elements was subjected to ground tests under exacting and realistic conditions. Every reform was developed in a pragmatic manner and given final shape on the basis of results obtained during actual trials. The British Army had been backed by vast arsenals of ammunition and armaments. We must learn to do with limited resources. The infantry division was made considerably more mobile and effective, though its basic structure remained unaltered in view of our reliance on conventional weapons. The firepower of the division was increased by 9 tons of metal per minute, all weapons firing at normal rate. Certain savings were made in administrative personnel, and mobility was increased by elimination of unnecessary equipment and introduction of more economical loading methods. These changes gave the infantry more teeth and less tail. It took years of work, but I still remember the excitement with which I watched the new experimental brigade under Gul Nawaz. This experiment determined the future organization of our units. The basic concept was to defend or attack a piece of ground with firepower and not with human bodies, introducing a seemingly irregular type of warfare on a large scale. The design of our training centers was completely out of date, and the new techniques and concepts evolved after the last war had not been applied. The principal difficulty was that each separate training center was designed to be self-sufficient in all trades required by the Army. The result was uneven standards of output and dissipation of training effort. Center commanders were expected to supervise subjects of which they themselves had little knowledge, and the existence of a chain of small centers inevitably added to overheads. I decided to centralize training. The smaller centers were amalgamated into more economical groups on the basis of common trades and common requirements. Where a trade required a high degree of technical skill and effort, the responsibility for training was entrusted to the agency most suited to the purpose. From this emerged the idea of amalgamating regiments with common traditions, common class composition, and common recruiting areas. The result was that the Baluch Regiment, the 8th Punjab Regiment, and the Bahawalpur Regiment became the new Baluch Regiment. The new Frontier Force Regiment absorbed the Frontier Force Rifles, the Pathan Regiment, and the old Frontier Force Regiment. And the 1st, 14th, 15th and 16th Punjab Regiments became the new Punjab Regiment. The newly reorganized East Bengal Regiment retained its entity and composition. I knew all this would set up a howl. The old regiments which lost their identity were understandably unhappy. Slowly and patiently we succeeded in converting old officers to new ideas. I must say they responded magnificently, after they got rid of their initial skepticism, and the results were beyond expectations. The credit for this goes to the officers and men for their spirit of compromise and adjustment over such delicate issues as customs, traditions and dress. In the meantime, the whole training system was undergoing radical change. The syllabuses were being revised, and the institutions were geared to the requirements of greater and more rapid turnover. The theoretical and practical aspects of training used to be treated in isolation. We combined trade training with military training. There was a tendency to forget that practical training and knowledge could be obtained only by actually serving with the troops, and that experience gained the hard way as a cog in the larger tactical machinery of the Army could not be replaced by purely theoretical study and separate academic training. We were gradually able to achieve the correct balance between academic instruction and practical work with the troops. The commanders, right down the chain, were given the responsibility for the training of their commands. Another difficulty with our training system was in our attempt to train a young officer at all levels of command, in addition to letting him specialize in the subject of his own arm or service. For every step forward in rank, the officer had to go back to school. This reduced the unit to the status of a transit camp, and the officer missed duty with the troops, which was really the essential part of his training. The logistic facilities available to the Army at the time of independence were practically non-existent. We succeeded in realigning our logistic concepts and doctrines, and in consequence our facilities, with the type and duration of any war in which the country might be involved. Greater reliance was placed on indigenous resources, and latent potential was exploited in sectors common to defense and commerce. Efforts were made to achieve greater standardization in the requirements of armed forces, and specifications were modified where necessary to accommodate indigenous capacity and workmanship. The organization and establishment of logistic installations and depots were revised to suit the current and anticipated needs of the reorganized field army. All this work relating to the reorganization of the army was carried out in the light of certain fundamentals of defense. Our first concern was the defense of Pakistan against any possible aggression by India. We knew that war with India would be a national war in every sense of the word. India's aim is to expand, dominate and spread her influence. In this she considers Pakistan as her enemy number one. Our strategic aim cannot be the conquest of India, because that would be a negation of the very concept of separation. Our aim must be to make India realize that it is not worth her while to maintain a hostile attitude towards us. India's military strength would always be greater than ours. Our aim should be to build up a military deterrent force, with adequate offensive and defensive power, enough at least, to neutralize the Indian army. India can concentrate her forces against us without warning. We must therefore have a standing army ready to take the field at a moment's notice. In our circumstances a territorial army has hardly any place. It would take too much time to mobilize and train such an army. It was a long and difficult struggle spread over several years. But in the end we were able to develop an agile and effective army capable of meeting any challenge. The new concept of fighting that we evolved, and the re-education of our officers and men has made the Pakistan army what it is today. It can take on an enemy several times its strength. And in spite of all the vicissitudes and pressures generated by political events, the army has been able to maintain its patriotic traditions and gradually develop into a powerful instrument of stability in the fife of the country. My prayer and belief is that it will always remain so, a sharp and reliable instrument of peace and war. This should not be taken to mean that while building the army I ignored the sister services, the Pakistan Navy and the Pakistan Air Force. I had a considerable hand in building them up into what they are today. The development of the Air Force has been my special concern, as the defense of Pakistan is essentially a land-air problem. As is the case with all continental countries,